o'clock p.m. So we would like to welcome you to our home webinar series. Today is the beginning of our series, Fill Your Pantry, and welcome to University of Illinois Extension. We will be presenting our webinar today on canning, and we are happy that you are all with us. We do have everybody muted, but please make sure to check that your microphone's on silent, that it's muted. And since we have quite a few people with us today, we've also put a stop on the video. So you will notice that you're not able to share a video, and this helps us to save our bandwidth. And you're welcome to use the chat box to ask questions. We'll try to answer questions as we go along, but at the end, we have some time reserved to answer questions as well. And after the webinar, you'll receive an email with an evaluation. We always appreciate honest feedback, and we will follow up with you via email with program handouts.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Susan. Susan Glassman is a University of Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness educator. She holds a master's degree in health education and administration and bachelor in food and nutrition with a specialization in dietetics from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Susan has been with Extension for about 20 years, and she serves LaSalle, Bureau, Marshall, and Putnam counties here in Illinois. Her expertise is in general nutrition, food safety, and chronic disease management.
Thank you, Diane. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and teammate, Diane Reinhold. She is a University of Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness educator. And Diane received a Bachelor of Science degree in Nutrition and Dietetics from North Dakota State University. She then went on to receive a Master of Science degree in Nutrition and Dietetics and a Master of Public Health degree from St. Louis University, while also receiving her Certificate of University Teaching. Before joining Extension, Diane served as a clinical dietitian. She specialized in medical nutrition therapy for geriatric and critical care populations, diabetes education, and supervised dietetic intern students. Diane's special areas of interest include obesity and chronic disease prevention and management, healthful lifestyles, food safety, and food preservation.
All right, thank you so much, Susan. And again, we want to welcome everyone once again. And I'm very excited you're able to join us. We had an overwhelming number of individuals sign up for our event today. And so we needed to go ahead and change the registration link. So we apologize in advance for that if there was any confusion. And for those that don't know, the University of Illinois Extension is a flagship outreach effort of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We offer research-based educational programs to residents of Illinois in all 102 counties and far beyond. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we want to acknowledge the importance of food safety when handling and preserving food. We also want everyone to learn proper food handling practices in order to decrease the risk of foodborne illnesses. And we want everyone to have a good understanding of the up-to-date food preservation's recommendations. What is the goal of food preservation? The ultimate goal of food preservation is to stop or slow down the rate of food spoilage. And it's a very safe way to preserve quality food while at home. You can use the produce that you're growing in your backyard or that you've purchased at your local farmer's market. You can prepare food in a way that is going to be best for you. You can also address dietary concerns. So if you're trying to reduce the amount of sodium in your diet and you really like tomato-based products, you can can your own tomato products and get minimal amounts of sodium. It's also economical and it's very self-satisfying. All right, so in order to really understand what we're going to be doing, there's some things, some basics we have to all know. And so our goal, again, to slow down food spoilage, prevent foodborne related illnesses, what we need to do is control the ideal growing conditions for harmful microorganisms that are going to cause food spoilage. And so we're able to do that by, again, controlling the environment. Harmful microorganisms, they need these 6 factors in order to increase and get to unhealthy numbers where they can cause harm to us humans. They need to have a food source. Most bacteria are going to be impacted by acidity, definitely temperature and time. The longer the harmful bacteria have to hang out, the more quickly they can get to numbers that are going to be unsafe. They're impacted by oxygen content, and they're also impacted by moisture level. So I say that they're impacted by moisture level, and we're looking at different types of food preservation throughout this summer series. So they're going to be talking about drying or dehydrating. And when we're dehydrating or drying food, we're removing the moisture. So again, thinking back to those 6 components, what can we do to control or reduce those 6 different factors? So when we remove the moisture, those microorganisms are not going to be able to grow. And it also impacts the enzyme activity. Freezing, during the freezing process, we're reducing that temperature. And when we reduce that temperature, those harmful microorganisms are not going to be able to grow, or they're not going to be able to grow very fast. And then also enzyme activity is going to be slowed. So again, throughout all of these presentations that we're going to be doing, talking about food preservation, always think back to those 6 key factors that are going to impact the rate at which food spoils and can cause harm. All right, so we're really focusing on canning today. And canning is a process in which food is placed in jars and heated to a high enough temperature that's going to destroy those harmful microorganisms and inactivate the enzymes within the food. Now, there are 2 types of canning. There's boiling water bath canning and pressure canning. And when you are canning, there's some things you have to consider. Again, canning is a fantastic way to be able to enjoy the foods from your garden all year long. But it's important that we all have a good understanding and follow best practices when canning to ensure that our garden harvest isn't going to go to waste and that it's going to be safe. So before you begin your food preservation journey, there's a few things you're going to need to consider. First off, do you have the correct equipment for whatever process you're going to be doing? Do you have enough time? Believe it or not, canning can be very time consuming. I always encourage people, if you're going to do canning, make sure that you have a good chunk of time set aside so you can just dedicate it to the canning process. You'll also need to make sure you have good quality produce. And you have to have the knowledge and skills. So today, perhaps you're here to either increase your knowledge, increase your skills, or maybe you simply want to be validated in what you're doing is the right thing. And then of course, do you have enough space? Do you have enough space to not only store your equipment, but also to store the food that you're going to be preparing? One of the things about canning is a can jar gets to be really heavy. It's glass, it has the food in, and you're going to be canning for the entire year. Most of us don't go to the grocery store and buy, I'm going to buy 2 cases of tomatoes. But when you're canning, you're going to be canning all of your tomato products for the entire year. So you have to have plenty of space to store all of that. When we talk about food preservation, you have to think that you're starting from the beginning. And the beginning means beginning in the garden, because well-preserved food begins in the garden. So let's look at some basic considerations before we even get into the kitchen, before we even talk about processing our food. So there are several different opportunities for our produce to become contaminated while we are out in the garden. For example, our soil. Our soil may contain botulinum spores, and therefore it's going to be important that we brush off any additional soil before we bring it indoors. And then once we bring it indoors, that we clean it properly. Another consideration is that you must use potable water for irrigating your vegetable gardens. So a lot of people like to use rain barrels to water their flower gardens. However, those rain barrels can harbor harmful microorganisms, which then can be absorbed into the plant and then be a possible contaminant. So if you think about some of the nationwide outbreaks we've had with some of our spinach, our leaf lettuces, and that has been because they have been exposed to non-potable water. And potable water is simply a term that tells us that water is safe for human consumption. We also need to make sure that we're keeping out any wildlife or domesticated animals. Again, if your animals are using your garden as a litter box, that's another potential source of contamination that's very harmful to humans. Other potential sources, making sure that we're using food grade containers. If you don't have a food grade container, I would encourage not using it. Once you have that produce brought into the house, make sure that you clean it thoroughly. Make sure that you wash and rinse it just before, and dry it just before you're ready to use it. Most of your produce you're not going to wash until you're ready to use it. So unfortunately, you can't like wash it the night before and then the next afternoon you'll go ahead and cut up your produce to use it and then process during the evening. Generally, what's recommended is that once you start, you process or you follow through with your process. Also making sure you're handling your produce post-harvest in a nice, safe manner. So for example, if you are going to can tomatoes, let's say it's Thursday afternoon, you got off work early, you go out, you pick your tomatoes because you know they're kind of getting close to being ripe, or maybe even a little overripe. You go, you pick your tomatoes. Well, then Thursday night you find out the kids had a soccer game that you weren't expecting. So then you're like, okay, well, I'll just work on the tomatoes tomorrow. They're sitting in some containers waiting to be used. So what the recommendation would be, go ahead and put that produce in a cooler because you want to control the temperature and keep them cool, because those tomatoes that got picked early, and let's say you're planning on them canning them Friday night after you get home from work, and if they're going to sit around, they have all of that time for those harmful microorganisms to multiply and that spoiling process to continue. Also making sure that you have good personal hygiene. And we all like to think that we have really good personal hygiene. However, unfortunately, sometimes we get lackadaisical. And if you're out in the garden, if you're like me, I always get lots of dirt under my nails. And unless I take that scrub brush and I'm scrubbing it really good, I may not be able to get all of that dirt out. Well, that dirt could then harbor harmful microorganisms. So again, make sure you're practicing good personal hygiene. If you have a cut or an open sore, make sure you're covering that, especially if you're out picking produce. There's a twofold reason for that. One, you don't want anything to be seeping or weeping from that cut or sore and get onto your food, but also you don't want to risk the opportunity of getting an additional infection from being out in the dirt. All right, so now that we've gotten our food from the garden, now we're going to be looking at how we can process safely in our home. So food safety, in addition to slowing down the rate at which food spoils, is very, very important. The CDC estimates that 48 million Americans each year are going to become sick with a foodborne related illness. Of that 48 million Americans, 128,000 are going to become ill or sick enough that they have to be hospitalized. And of that 128,000 that are hospitalized, unfortunately, 3,000 individuals are going to die. And it's very sad because all of those things are very preventable. And you might be thinking, well, that kind of just really happens in, our big food industries. So again, thinking back to some of our leaf lettuce, spinach, our cantaloupe food safety outbreaks that we've had over the years, unfortunately, that does happen. However, 70% of foodborne related illnesses actually are going to originate in your home. And that number is really high because, again, people become lackadaisical. They think they're doing a good job. However, they may not be doing as good of a job as they think. All right, so we, had good practices getting our food from the garden, or from planting it, bringing it from the garden into our home. And now we have to make sure that we're keeping our food safe once it's in the home. So our canning jars, they have to be washed before you use them. So if you're thinking, yeah, but you know what, I washed those jars before I put them away this winter after I used, those canned tomatoes, those canned kidney beans, that canned corn, and you're thinking, why do I need to wash them again? Well, dust and other microorganisms may have come in contact with those jars. So you're going to want to wash them with hot soapy water, and also make sure that you wash the rings. You're also going to want to make sure that your workstation, your work area is clean. So washing your countertops, your cutting boards, and your utensils. And then also sanitizing those surfaces. Especially if you think about cutting boards, they can get lots of nicks and grooves in them over the years. So making sure you're sanitizing those areas. All right, and the nice thing is you don't have to go out and purchase a really expensive sanitizing solution. You can create your own. You use 1 teaspoon of bleach to 1 quart of water. So this is a very inexpensive way to create a sanitizing solution in your home that you can use. However, you have to remake that solution every 7 days. So if you made it on the weekend as you're canning, and then you thought you would get back to some of your canning later in the week, but you didn't actually get there, and it's the next weekend, go ahead and remake that solution. When you spray that solution, allow it to sit on the contact surface area for at least 1 minute before you take a single-use towel and wipe it off, because you want to give time for that bleach to interact with anything that may be on that countertop that's not visible to the naked eye, or you can simply let it air dry. All right, so now we are going to talk about preserving safely. So there are 2 methods of canning. The first one is the boiling water bath canning, and this is going to be used for high acidic foods. Generally speaking, your boiling water bath canning process is going to have a shorter processing time compared to that of a pressure canner. The pressure canner is going to be used for low acidic foods. Generally, it's going to have a longer processing time. And some people say, well, Diane, I really like to use my pressure canner to process my tomatoes. And that's fine. You can use a pressure canner when canning high acidic foods. However, my question for you would be, why are you doing that? I'm a firm believer in wanting to know, why are those recommendations out there? Why do you want people to do X, Y, and Z? Because if you are using your pressure canner to can your tomatoes, your product is going to have a much softer texture. So if you like the texture of having that really very soft, almost mushy texture from your canned tomato products, then go ahead and use it. But if you don't like that, then I wouldn't recommend using it, because you can use the boiling water bath canner when canning tomatoes. All right, you've heard me mention acidity a couple different times. And remember, acid is one of those factors that are going to play a role in controlling the ideal growing conditions for those harmful microorganisms. And so why is that? Let's take a look and find out why. First off, I just want to share, we have high acidic foods and low acidic foods. And high acidic foods have a pH value of 4.6 or less. And pH is a term that is used to measure acidity or whether or not something is basic. The higher the value, the less acid that is going to be within that food. Foods containing a higher acid levels are going to inhibit the growth of the botulism spores that are responsible for botulism. So what are those foods? Typically, it's going to be your strawberries, blackberries, pickles, apples, plums, cherries. Our low acidic foods are going to have a pH value higher than 4.6. And examples of those types of foods are going to be your peas, your corn, kidney beans, carrots, squash, and your meats and poultries. And so your low acidic foods are going to need to be processed using a pressure canner. Now, I already mentioned tomatoes and shared that some people like to use their pressure canners to process tomatoes. And again, it always surprises me that people like to do that. The interesting thing about tomatoes is that tomatoes' pH value falls on the borderline. And therefore, tomatoes must be acidified, meaning we have to add additional acid when we are using tomato, or when we're processing and canning tomato-based products. And some people say like, oh, well, I have a hybrid tomato, I have an heirloom tomato, it has a higher acidic level. And really the fact is, the acidic level of tomatoes is so close to that borderline that we don't know that if it's going to be safe or not. So if you are harvesting your tomatoes and they're on a dead vine, maybe the vine got broken, and so for a day or less, those tomatoes have been sitting on a broken vine, that's going to impact the pH level. Also the temperature. If you're harvesting your tomatoes at a temperature between 36 and 32, that's going to affect their pH value. And so that is why we say they have to be acidified. So what does it mean when we say you have to acidify? Well, it means we have to add additional acid to the product. So this is per pint. So if you're doing quarts, you have to increase the amount that you're putting in, but this is per pint. So per pint, you're going to add an additional 1 tablespoon of bottled lemon juice. Okay, so another question I commonly get is, does it have to be bottled lemon juice? Yes, because we know bottled lemon juice is going to have a standardized pH value. Well, why can't I use fresh lemons? Well, we don't know what the pH value is of the 6 different lemons that you just squeezed, because each lemon can have a different pH value. The other thing you can do, you can use a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid or 2 tablespoons of vinegar. Now, many people don't like to use vinegar because it's going to give an undesirable flavor. So I personally, when I'm canning my tomato products, I like to do the teaspoon of citric acid. It's just really easy to do, and it's fairly inexpensive, and I don't feel that it significantly impacts the flavor of the tomato-based products. So kind of going back to the whole, well, I process my tomato products with the pressure canner because I don't want to have to acidify my tomato products. Well, regardless if you're using a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner, you still have to acidify in order to ensure that your tomato products are going to be safe. All right, so we're going to now talk about kind of more about preventing that foodborne related illness and why that's important. So when we are using a boiling water bath canner, we are going to reach a temperature of 212 degrees at sea level. That temperature is going to be high enough to kill most yeast, molds, and harmful bacteria. They're going to be destroyed during that boiling process. And a pressure canner is going to reach a temperature of 240 degrees or more at sea level. And that is going to be a high enough temperature to destroy the harmful toxins produced by the Clostridium botulinum, otherwise what we just a lot of times call botulism. And it's going to be able to destroy that, which is super important. All right, a little bit about our botulinum. This handy dandy little germ is kind of rugged and tough, and it actually can be found in soils and on fresh produce. And that's because it's a naturally occurring bacteria. And it exists in two different phases, either as vegetative cells or as spores. And so those little spores are hanging out. Maybe you didn't scrub your low acidic produce as well as you thought you had. And there's a little tiny microscopic organism on your produce. And what happens during the canning process, an anaerobic environment is created. And the botulinum, they like to grow in that anaerobic environment. And they produce vegetative cells. Those cells then multiply very rapidly, and that's what produces the harmful toxin. Botulism is a form of food poisoning, or it is food poisoning, and it can be potentially deadly. Food can contain toxins without showing any signs. You can't just look at a jar and say like, oh, you know what, that has botulism in it. You can't tell. So it's important that you follow the recommendations for preserving low acidic foods and follow them perfectly so that you can reduce the risk of incurring the botulism food poisoning. So symptoms for a botulism are usually going to occur within 12 to 72 hours after the food item has been ingested. It's going to be attacking your central nervous system, and it can lead to blurred vision, double slit vision, difficulty swallowing, speaking, and breathing. So it's very, very dangerous, and you need an antidote if you were to have botulism, and that comes from the CDC, which I always think is very fascinating. The other way to prevent a foodborne related illness when you're canning is to make sure that you're not practicing any outdated canning methods. So, such as using jars that are not designed for home canning. Okay, by show of hands, how many people either do or did, or maybe had a mother or a grandmother that would recycle, reuse, repurpose? And what we would end up doing is reusing those commercial mayonnaise jars. Yeah, my mom did it also, Christy. And but unfortunately, those jars are not designed to withstand the repeated processing that our home canning jars are able to withstand. Another outdated process is the open kettle method. So foods for the open kettle method that is when foods are heated on the stove. They're put in jars and a lid is placed on top of them without additional processing. And then, and my mom did this too. And in her defense, this was what was recommended because years ago, we didn't know any better. So she would put the jelly in the canning jars, put the lids on, and then she would flip them upside down and leave them overnight on the counters to cool. And then in the morning, she would test to see if they had sealed or not. Another outdated canning method is using alternative processing methods. So processing by way of microwave or the oven. Again, by show of hands, how many people know of or did themselves a method where you would take a roaster oven and plug it in and put your jars in and then let them simmer overnight for like 12 hours. Or even stick them in the oven overnight at a low temperature. Again, these are just outdated processes. As time has gone on, our knowledge and the science has really changed. And so we know that these methods are no longer safe. Another outdated canning method is using a pressure cooker instead of a pressure canner. A pressure cooker is not the same as a pressure canner. Now, unfortunately, with the electric pressure cookers making a huge comeback, I have had several people in my community reach out to me and say, hey, I'm gonna use my electronic pressure cooker to go ahead and do my canning this summer. I bought 3 pressure cookers so I don't have to worry about dealing with the canner on the electric, or excuse me, the pressure canner on the stove. And I'm like, I'm really, really sorry, but that is not safe. So even though those different manufacturers are making those claims that, hey, this is safe, we can do it, unfortunately, they have not provided the necessary documentation to the USDA so that we can get behind them and say, yes, this is safe. Because those electronic pressure cookers are not able to reach and maintain a high enough temperature to then safely process. So again, it is not recommended. Another outdated process is using a 1-piece lid. The recommendation is to always use a 2-piece lid. Also, we no longer recommend using paraffin wax to seal your jars during the processing of your canned goods. And again, that was something you used years ago. It's also incredibly important that you are using a scientifically tested recipe. So previously, I used to say, it's important to use a tested recipe. And I would have someone say, well, my neighbor Joe tested this recipe and it worked just fine. Why can't I use it? Well, sorry, that's not what I meant. So then I had to start saying, use a scientifically tested recipe. So examples of unsafe recipes are recipes that are used in personal blogs, your church cookbooks, or that have been passed down from families from generation to generation. It might be a good tasting recipe. It may not be a safe recipe. So what is a safe recipe? So a safe recipe is going to be one that has been scientifically tested. When you think about a jar, you think about that core temperature. Are you processing that jar so that it's going to reach a high enough temperature at the core to kill any harmful microorganisms that can lead to a foodborne related illness or such as botulism? Does it have the adequate acidic level? And keep in mind that the viscosity or how thick a product is, that is going to impact how long a recipe needs to be processed. And so the recipes that you're going to find in the So Easy to Preserve book, the Ball book, or the USDA Guide to Home Food Preservation, all of those recipes have been scientifically tested. And we know that without a doubt, when followed properly, those recipes are going to be safe for consumers to use and have safe foods. All right, so What other things do you need to know? Well, believe it or not, looking at this list, oh my goodness, there's a whole bunch of things you need to have. Now, you don't need to have everything, but one of the things that I have found when I do my canning, having the right equipment makes a world of difference. So one thing that is an absolute must, you have to have a canning rack. Having a wide mouth funnel, that isn't necessarily an absolute must. It just makes life easier, especially if you're a little clumsy and, you know, messy like myself. You also need a canning jar lifter. That's going to help you prevent getting burnt. Having a lid lifter, you don't necessarily need that anymore because you're not going to boil your lids like you once did. Having a ladle, a bubble freer, a jar wrench, a scale. A lot of your recipes, it's going to tell you per pound. So you do need a scale depending upon what products you're actually making. So let's talk a little bit about canning jars first. So you want to make sure that you're using a mason type jar. A mason type jar is going to have a threaded top where the lid and the ring can be secured. Mason jars are either going to be regular or wide mouth, and they come in different sizes. Your jar sizes for canning are going to be your half pint, pint and a half, that's out there, but if you're looking in your recipe books, you are not going to be able to find a temperature that, or a processing time that is going to accommodate the pint and a half. Therefore, we recommend processing under the same conditions that you would a quart jar. So keep in mind, if you're going to process with a pint and a half and process with the quart time, keep in mind you're going to be applying heat for an additional amount of time. That additional heat is going to affect the overall texture of your product. You're going to end up with a softer textured product. So I just recommend not using a pint and a half. Sure, they look cute. However, depending upon how particular you are, you're going to have to process it the same amount of time as you would a quart jar. There's also a half-gallon size. However, the half-gallon size jars are only recommended to be used for grape juice and apple juice. So do not process tomato juice using a half-gallon jar. And again, all of the things that I'm sharing with you, this is related to home food preservation. I understand that out in the industry, you go to the store and they have these beautiful jars and this looks so cool and you kind of would like to do that yourself. However, when food manufacturers are processing in a factory, they have a whole different set of tools at their disposal that we do not have. So home canning is very different than what you see with regards to products available that come from companies out in the community. All right, what type of lid? Remember I said don't use a one-piece lid. You need to use a two-piece self-sealing lids. So you're going to have your metal screw band, and then you're going to have your metal lid. On that metal lid, there is going to be a sealing component. And unfortunately, your canning lids, you only get to use them once. You cannot reuse them. Do not be tempted. I know it gets to be expensive and you feel like, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with this. Let me just, reuse it. Don't do it. Because if you're reusing it, there is no way to guarantee that your product is going to seal and maintain that seal. So maybe you went ahead and reused a lid and then put your items in your storage area, whether it's the basement, the cellar, you have cabinets, whatnot, and it becomes unsealed while they are being stored. So again, never reuse canning lids. Now, so remember I said that the metal lid is going to contain a sealing compound. So years ago, we used to recommend, or the manufacturers actually recommended, that you would need to simmer your lids. And when you did that, you would simmer them to a temperature of 180 degrees. And it was very important that you never boiled them. Well, after extensive testing and changes that manufacturers have made, the good news is we no longer have to get those lids warmed up before we use them. So that's going to save us a step, and that is going to help us decrease the amount of time that we spend in the kitchen. Because a lot of times, let's face it, canning season, it's hot, it's humid. You know, if you don't have air conditioning, your house gets that much hotter, that much more humid. And if you do have air conditioning, you're giving your air conditioner a run for its money. All right, so yay, I've just decreased the amount of time that you are in the kitchen because you don't have to preheat the lids. Now, this is about sterilizing our jars. So keep in mind that sanitizing and sterilizing are not the same. A lot of times people ask me, can I just sterilize my jars in my dishwasher? The answer is your dishwasher really sterilized? Because most dishwashers are going to sanitize. Sanitizing and sterilizing are different. That's very important to keep in mind. So how and when to sterilize your jars? You are going to sterilize your jars after you have washed them, and then you're going to put them in a canner of boiling water, and you're going to boil them for 10 minutes. All products that are going to be processed less than 10 minutes should be sterilized. You should sterilize those jars. You take them right out of the water bath canner when they're still hot, and you put your product in, and then you can go ahead and continue processing. And generally, your recipe is going to tell you this information. All right, filling your jars. So when you're filling your jars, you want to make sure the jars are clean and use that wide mouth funnel. Again, I'm super clumsy. And so even if I do use the wide funnel, sometimes I end up with food all over the rim. But using that wide mouth funnel is going to really decrease the ability or decrease the amount of food residue that you can get on your jars. But it's going to be very important that you leave enough headspace. So headspace is the unfilled space above the food and below the lid. And so I have my arrows there so that you can really get a good close-up picture of that. So how much headspace do you need? Well, always follow the recommendations for your recipe. But here are some general rules with regards to headspace. For jams and jellies, you're going to leave about a 1/4 inch. For your tomatoes and fruits, you're going to leave a 1/2 inch. And anything through our pressure canning, you're going to leave anywhere between a 1 inch and 1.25 inches anytime you're processing your low acidic foods. Now, there is this handy dandy tool out there, and it has little notches on it, and it will tell you a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, or 1.25 inches. And it's really nice and convenient. I think that it's great, especially for novice canners or those that are just starting out. However, after you get a feel for canning and you've been doing it for a while, you can go ahead and eyeball, making sure you have enough headspace. But just keep in mind, keep your eyes honest, and feel free to do some spot checks. Get a ruler out, use this particular tool, and go ahead and just make sure that you are allowing enough space and making sure that you're not providing too much space. Why is it important to make sure you have the appropriate amount of headspace? Well, if you have too little headspace, meaning you do not have enough room for the food to expand during the heating process, what can happen is that food can bubble up during the processing and come out of the jar. And then it's going to deposit residue on the rim, and that is going to interfere with the proper sealing of your product. Also, you're going to be losing product into your canner, and then you have a big mess to clean up. And nobody likes that, right? All right, so what if you have too much headspace? So let's say you're like, oh no, I don't want to have too much headspace. So what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to make sure that you have just the right amount, because if you have too much room between the food and the bottom of the lid, what ends up happening? You have all of that extra air. Remember, during the canning process, additional air is vented out of the jar and it creates that vacuum seal. If you leave too much space, it's not going to be able to vent all of that additional air out. And then you're going to have that extra air in there. Remember, oxygen is one of those factors that we want to control for when we're looking at preventing food spoilage. And so what can end up happening? You can end up having your food become discolored, and the jar just might not seal properly because not all of the air was forced out of the jar. All right, so filling our jar, other things in addition to wiping that rim off, and what I recommend using a clean single-use cloth. A lot of times when I do my canner per batch, I'll just use one paper towel per whatever the 8 or 7 jars or however many jars that I'm putting in my canner. But the other thing that you want to remember is to get the bubbles out. You want to free the bubbles, right? So you can use a bubble freer. Yes, there actually is a tool called a bubble freer. Or I like to just use a plastic little white knife, disposable knife, because if it gets discolored, I can just toss it out. Also, it's not going to scratch the inside of the jar and compromise the integrity of the jar. And then also make sure you're securing your lids safely. It's important that your lids are finger tight. If they are too loose, liquid may escape during the processing of your product, and that may cause your lid the seal to actually fail. If your lids are too tight, what can end up happening? Air can vent out and the food can become discolored, but even worse, your lids can buckle, so then you have to reprocess or freeze that food, or the jars can end up breaking. Ugh, that's a huge mess to have to deal with. All right, processing time. So each recipe is to be unique and different, and the processing time is going to vary depending upon the foods that you're processing. So always follow the directions very, very carefully. And the processing time is going to be different for quarts versus pints. And if you are at a different altitude level, that is also going to make a difference. So you have to make sure that you are adjusting appropriately. And it's very important, never under-process, because if you under-process, that can result in food spoilage. If you over-process, that can result in an undesirable texture or product that you're going to then have to deal with. Adjusting for altitude. Why do you have to adjust for altitude? Well, because when you increase altitude, water boils faster, right? So that's kind of a problem. So water is going to boil faster at a lower temperature. So lowering the boiling point of the temperatures, it's not going to be effective at killing that bacteria. So you have to make those adjustments for altitude. A lot of times, they're going to have instructions right in the book. You're going to either have to increase the processing time or the amount of pressure, especially if you're pressure canning, to reach that lower boiling temperature. So always follow the directions listed in the recipe. All right, this is what you really wanted to know, right? You're like, oh, I didn't know I needed to know all that other stuff. Well, now we're going to talk about boiling water canning. All right, so as I mentioned, you're going to use it for high acid foods. These canners are made from aluminum and or they're porcelain covered steel, and they're going to have a removable perforated rack, and they're going to have a lid that's going to fit very nicely on that. When you have your water bath canner filled with jars, it's going to take about 20 to 30 minutes for that water to boil. So again, always keep that in mind when you're looking at the amount of time that you're going to need to go ahead and process your canning products. Also keep in mind that a boiling water bath canner is going to reach a temperature of 212 degrees. And it must be maintained for a specified amount of time. It will never, ever, ever reach a high enough temperature to destroy the bacteria that are going to produce the harmful botulism toxin that can cause damage to us. All right, this is another thing that's important. You need to get a ruler out, especially for novice canners or those that are just beginning. When you put your jars in the canner, first off, don't start off with your canner plump full of water, because when you put the jars in, the water is going to be displaced, and then you're going to have a flooded stovetop, and that's a problem, right? So, all right, when you put your jars in, you are going to account for the water that is going to be displaced. What we recommend, have a small kettle of water on a back burner, just kind of simmering away, so that you can add additional hot water if you don't have enough in there. But you're going to measure and make sure that the water does not go above 2 inches. You're going to want 1 to 2 inches of water covering the tops of your jars. And that is going to help accommodate for the evaporation process that occurs throughout the processing of your jars. And you might be very, very surprised. I know I've been surprised at how much water actually evaporates. All right, so what is the process of a boiling water bath canning? So first, you're going to be prepping your food using a tested recipe. While you're preparing your food, depending upon how involved it is, what I would recommend doing, have your canner half full of water and have it simmering. Make sure you keep the lid on. You don't want that water to be evaporating out. Fill your jars. As you're filling your jars, go ahead and turn up the heat so that the water is going to have a better chance to start boiling. After you get your jars filled, the water may not be boiling yet. That's fine. Go ahead and place them on the canning rack and then slowly place them in the water. Check the height. Make sure that it's no more than 1 to 2 inches. I really recommend measuring with a ruler. I know some people that have been canning for 15, 20, 30 years, and they're like, I can just eyeball it. So I would just say keep your eyeballs honest, right? And you're not going to begin the timer for the processing of those jars until you have reached a full rolling boil. I call this the scary boil. And here's a picture, because when you lift the lid off the canner, water splashes and everywhere because it's such an intense boil. That is when you begin your timer. After your processing time has been complete, go ahead and turn off the heat. Then you're going to remove the lid and wait 5 minutes. Let let's say you're doing jam. Let your jam sit for 5 minutes undisturbed before removing them from the canner. And here they're using a jar lifter. And again, that's a great way to help so that you don't get burned. Moving on to our pressure canner. So our modern pressure canners are lightweight. They have thinner walls. They have gaskets, removable racks, and they have a lot of safety features that maybe years ago the pressure canners didn't have. So always use a canner that has the underwriter's laboratory information with it, because that way you can ensure that it's actually safe to use. Now, your pressure canner is going to have a removable seal. Most of them do. That seal needs to be cleaned, and every year the gauge, if you have a pressure canner that has a gauge, it needs to be inspected and checked. Other little things that are about the pressure canner that's important, again, they're used for low acidic foods. It's going to reach a temperature of 240 degrees at sea level with the weight of 10.5 pounds. And it's going to take a while, just like the 20 to 30 minutes for the water bath canner to get to that rolling boil. When you load your pressure canner with your jars, it's going to take about 12 to 15 minutes before you're going to see steam coming out that vent. The important thing about pressure canning is that there are multiple factors at play. So keep in mind those 6 factors we talked about, the food, time, temperature, moisture level, acidity level, and oxygen. So when you're pressure canning, it depends on the type of food that you're processing. depends on the acidic level, the type of recipe that you're using, the processing time, the temperature, the amount of pressure with the weighted gauge or with your just gauge in general. And that is going to culminate with regards to your processing method. When you're filling your pressure canner, again, it's interesting because when I first pressure canned, I thought, oh, well, I have to fill this thing up with water. Nope, you don't. This is the nice part, because you're only going to put 2 to 3 inches of hot water at the bottom of your pressure canner. And what's going to end up happening during the processing, all of that water is going to then turn into steam, and it's going to vent out. And not all of it, a good chunk of it, I should say. And it's going to kind of vent out. So I have that orange circle. That is your canner rack. So make sure that you have your canner rack in your canner. You never want to put your jars directly in the canner without the rack for your pressure canner, because those jars can then break. So here's the process. Prep your food using a tested recipe. While you're preparing your food, have your water simmering. Well, since there isn't as much, you may not have to do that. It's just kind of a personal preference. Fill your jars. As you're filling your jars, turn up the heat to kind of get that water more agitated, heating up quicker. And then go ahead and put your jars in the pressure canner. The pressure canner rack is generally in there from the get-go. And then fasten the lid. That is going to need to fit very snugly and very secure, because it's going to form that seal. And then if you have a weight, keep that off of the vent port. And you can see I have that with an orange circle there as well. Turn up the heat setting, and you're going to wait until steam starts coming out of that vent port. Once that has vented continuously for 10 minutes, then you're going to go ahead and put the weight back on that port, and then it's going to pressurize. You're going to see your gauge start to move, and then it'll reach its pressure, and then you're going to have to watch to make sure that it maintains that pressure. When you're done processing, turn off your heat, allow your canner to depressurize, remove that weight, and then wait 10 minutes before opening the lid and removing the jars. Now, the dial gauge, this is what your most gauges are going to look like if you're using a dial gauge. And you're going to notice that once you put that weight on the vent port, the pressure is going to go up, and it's generally going to go up to that 8 pounds pretty quickly. And then you're going to watch it and adjust it once it reaches that. And when I say adjust, I mean adjusting the temperature on your stovetop. So, but you should never, ever, ever leave your pressure canner unattended, because if at any time during the processing procedure, the pressure goes below the recommended amount of pressure, then you're going to have to start all over again. And, you know, if it took 15 minutes for it to start venting, and then another 10 minutes for it to vent, you've already have a half hour invested. So just make sure that you never leave your pressure canner unattended. Now, if you're using a weighted gauge, you're not going to have that dial gauge to kind of tell you what the temperature is, but you're going to have to be able to be there in the kitchen and listen to the gauge as it jiggles. So let the pressure rise until the gauge, until the weight jiggles. And so every canner, every stove is going to have a different sound to it if you have a weighted gauge. I personally haven't used a weighted gauge because I feel like I have a short attention span, and I don't think I could sit and pay attention to, is it rocking X number of times per minute per whatever the manufacturer says. So I like the dial gauge, but that's my own personal preference. So after your jars have finished processing, you're going to let them sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. It's recommended that you use a cooling rack. Why do you use a cooling rack? Well, that cooling rack is going to help allow air to get underneath the jars so that they can cool at a much rapid rate, a much more uniform rate. The other thing to keep in mind is that you are not going to take a jar and place on a countertop because that can either crack the jar or it could crack your countertop. Placing something super hot on, let's say, a marble or some type of stone countertop. And you might think, well, it's not that big of a deal, but if you have your air conditioning in your home running, that countertop gets quite cool. And so after you've already invested all of the time in planting your garden, processing, preparing everything, you don't want to, lose a jar because you're like, oh, that's so much time and effort I put in. So go ahead and use that cooling rack and make sure that you don't put too much weight. So you may need a couple different cooling racks. I know my mom didn't have a cooling rack, so she would lay towels down, and that does work because, again, you don't want to put your product directly on the countertop. All right, how do you know if your jars have sealed? Well, you're going to have to test. So you can press the center of the lid with your finger, and you can hear whether or not it has that concave sound or not of sealing. If your jars do not seal, you have the option to reprocess them. However, they have to be reprocessed within 24 hours. So if you've let them sit for 8 hours undisturbed overnight, you have to still take into consideration, okay, if I'm going to reprocess, I have to get, going on this so that I can get this done. So what we recommend is go ahead and put them in the refrigerator until you're able to reprocess them. But keep in mind, when you reprocess, you're going to end up with a much mushier product. So you may want to consider, do I want to reprocess them? Do I want to freeze them? Is this something I can use really quick in the next couple days? So it really depends what your end game is and how much time you actually have. All right, storing your jars, and I apologize, we're going over just by a few minutes. Storing your jars. Remove the screw bands. Even though it looks super cute to have your jars with their screw bands in, you want to remove them. And you want to do that because, one, you're going to be testing to make sure the lids are actually sealed. You're going to want to make sure that no food escaped during the processing because, again, that can compromise the integrity of the seal. And you're going to want to wash and a lot of times reuse those rings that are on the screw bands. The other thing is when you're storing your jars, make sure you store them in a cool, dry, dark location. So when I say a cool location, I like specifics. So 50 to 70 degrees is what is ideal. Do not store them above 95 degrees. That is going to put them at greater risk for a foodborne related product for you to end up having a product that's unsafe to eat. Also, make sure that they are not going to be stored in an area that's so cold that they accidentally freeze. Because when they freeze, what happens? Food, things expand when they freeze. So that can pop the lid off and that can compromise the seal of the jars. But then maybe it self-seals when you, it might freeze and then thaw and then it self-seals. But during that time that it was unsealed, it becomes unsafe. The other thing is when I say dry location, make sure that you're cognizant of the humidity level, the moisture content. Those lids can corrode. They're made out of metal. So make sure that the moisture isn't going to be that it's going to encourage the metal to corrode. And then really for best use within 1 year, and that's for best quality of product. Here are some very important resources. The So Easy to Preserve 6th edition book. When I first started canning and food preservation, they handed me the book and said, this is your Bible. And I was like, really? That's it? There's only one book? Well, you know what? This is your main book. Because the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, that book references the So Easy to Preserve book as well. And the same with the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Website is there, and it's a free resource. But that information also references the So Easy to Preserve book as well. So lots of things, but the information is, you know, based on science, and really the So Easy to Preserve book is going to be your mainstay with regards to food preservation. We also offer an online program through the University of Illinois Extension, and they have different modules. So normally when I teach this class, I teach it in a 3.5-hour session. So when I was said, oh, I have to teach it in an hour, I was like, oh, I hope I can do it in an hour. And again, thank you for sticking with me. It's a little over. But the Preserve the Taste of Summer, it gets down into more information and breaks it down more. So summing up today's presentation, home food preservation can be a cost savings way for you to preserve your food. But some methods are going to have a higher startup cost than others. And you're going to have the knowledge, the skills, the space, all of those things we talked about earlier. And always, always, always practice food safety. You don't want to put yourself, your family, your friends, your loved ones at risk. So keep in mind, you know, if you make food and serve it and it's consumed in 1 or 2 hours or 1 or 2 days, versus if you're preserving food and it is going to sit in the pantry for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months before it's used, you know, that time allows those harmful microorganisms to get to numbers that are unsafe for humans. And then, of course, always use resources and stay up to date on the latest food preservation recommendations. So, Susan, are you there? Kristen, are you there?
I'm here. Diane, this is Mary Liz. Susan, are you here now?
I'm here, no. Yes. So I've been keeping track of some questions, and there were quite a few questions in the chat box. So thank you everybody for putting those in there. Mary Liz and I have been trying to field some of those questions as you were speaking, but I do have a list of some if you'd like me to go through those right now. The first question is, will the PowerPoint slides be available?
The PowerPoint slides will not be available. However, we will have an amazing handout for you. And we'll share that with you after you complete the survey. So today at the end of our presentation, we'll go ahead and send a, hey, thanks for attending email. And then in that email, there's gonna be a survey link. And so we would like you to fill out the survey link, and then you will then be emailed probably next Wednesday, information on all of the handouts, because we want to allow people enough time to complete the survey, and then the handouts will be shared with you if you fill out that survey.
Okay, great. Next question is, can you freeze produce and then can it at a later date?
Yes. And it's recommended that you do blanch, but we'll talk about freezing next week.
Okay. Someone has 40-year-old jars. Are these safe to use?
I would not recommend using jars that are that old. I would recommend recycling them and then getting newer jars. And I mean, you have to take into consideration, are they jars that have been used? Because if they've been used over time, glass can become brittle. There might be nicks and chips and all that type of stuff in them. So unfortunately, I know we live in a disposable world. I'm all for reusing, repurposing, but I would have to probably, the recommendation would be not to use them. But of course, there's always your own personal judgment at play.
All right, thank you. Is there a way to get family recipes tested or to test acidity of that recipe at home?
You would need to contact a laboratory that could do the testing for you. And we can, Mary Liz, are you still on? We can send out a list of companies or laboratories that do testing of recipes. However, generally there is a substantial cost involved.
Yeah, we can do that. Actually, Diane, some of them only charge about $25. So I'll forward the addresses to you, and you can attach them to the correspondence with the attendees.
Okay, good. I didn't know that. Thank you.
All right, next question. If a recipe calls for 8 pints, but you only use 6, does the processing time change?
So it's always important to follow the recipe exact. So if your recipe calls for 8 and you're using 6, you're changing the density of that product as well as the acidity level. So again, thinking back to those 6 factors: time, acidity, the type of food product, the density of the product, all of those factors are at play. So please do not change recipes. Follow them exactly.
Can you put sealing lids in the dishwasher rather than washing them by hand?
The lids, I would just wash them by hand. Why? I think that would, to put them in the dishwasher, like a dishwasher maybe takes an hour to run versus just washing them by hand. It might take 2 minutes. I mean, sorry.
Okay. Next question. There's a couple more questions. If cold packing meat, can this person sterilize their jars and let them cool before packing the meat into them?
I would follow the recipe exactly. So, Mary Liz, do you have a comment on that?
All right. Right, there'd be no need to sterilize the jars before you're processing meat. You know, we only sterilize jars when the processing time is less than 10 minutes. When you're processing meat, you're talking 95, 100 minutes. So just make sure they're super clean. And then again, as Diane said, follow your recipe.
And last question. If you have too little space in your jar and it didn't seal, can you redo the same jar with less food right away?
You would want to take the food out and wash that jar. You're going to need to get a new lid, wash the ring off or the screw band, and start all over. To do it properly is what the recommendation would be.
All right, well, those are all the questions I saw in the chat box. So Mary Liz, I know you've been keeping an eye. Have you seen anything else come in that hasn't been addressed yet?
And just for time's sake, maybe we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll go ahead and kind of wrap things up here.
I think you've answered everything. I think we're good to go. Oh, wait. Here's the last one. I do have a question. What are the 2 and 2 yellow lines on the screen?
This is a different platform, and I think I accidentally drew on my screen, so I apologize. They're squigglies that I accidentally did somehow. All right, well, thank you all for your excellent questions. I just want to share with you a couple opportunities. So we have the Illinois Extension Extending Wellness program going on, and you can sign up to get wellness tips, and it's going to include information on your finances, on family issues. And when I say family issues, it's going to range from dealing with children to dealing with aging parents to being a caregiver. We're also going to have healthy eating information, and you're not going to receive more than 2 texts a week, and we're not going to share your information. And if you sign up and you decide this isn't what you wanted, you can always stop at any time. I also want to encourage everyone to come back next week. Next week, we're going to be freezing foods at home. So lots of good information there. Again, Wednesday, June 10th from 1 to 2 p.m. We also have some other wonderful opportunities here at the University of Illinois Extension. We have a summer self-care program, and that is going to give information, with so much media hype over the latest self-care trends, it's hard to know what advice to trust. And this series is going to offer evidence-based strategies for improving your self-care routine. and it's going to help allow you to choose programs that are going to be really the best for you. We also have a program called Let's Talk Money. It's an 8-week series, and it's going to help you talk to both your family, friends, and financial professionals about money. And so we'll include that information when we send out our information. We want to thank you so much for attending today. Thank you for staying with us. We have additional resources. We have What's Cooking with Mary Liz, and you got to hear Mary Liz's voice today. We have some really great canning, water bath canning, pressure canning videos to watch. Also the University of Illinois Extension website. And you can also join us around the table. That's our Facebook page. And also thank you to Kristen and Mary Liz and Susan. These are all my colleagues for helping us out today. And I just wish you a fabulous week. And thank you so much for attending. Look for our follow-up email. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for tuning into CUI's TV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically for Champaign County older adults. Take care and stay safe.